Listen, just one more thing.
Hello there. Welcome to my review of episode 0 of Columbo, the series pilot and second pilot movie, Ransom for a Dead Man. First broadcast on the 1st of March 1971 on NBC, 6 months before the first season began airing. It was written by Lincoln Levinson as well as Dean Hargrove and Gene Thompson, who would all go on to pen further episodes, and directed by Richard Irving, who had directed the original TV movie. The episode begins with ominous music over the Universal logo, before cutting to a woman creating her own ransom note, something we would see again in later episode Negative Reaction. The woman is Leslie Williams, played by Lee Grant. Grant was born Leova Rosenthal in New York on the 31st of October, during the mid-1920s, although the actual year is disputed. She made her stage debut in 1931 at the Met Opera and studied ballet and acting, which is what she would eventually focus on. She made her Broadway debut in 1948 and then in film in 1951. Her career ground to a halt just as it was in its ascendance after she was accused of being a communist by Joseph McCarthy's HUAC hearings and was blacklisted for the rest of the decade. As she rebuilt her career in the 60s, she gained a role in the television series Peyton Place, winning an Emmy, and appearing in the film In the Heat of the Night. In the 70s, she received 3 Oscar nominations for The Landlord, Shampoo, and Voyage of the Damned, as well as appearing in this episode of Columbo. She would go on to perform with Falk on Broadway in The Prisoner of Second Avenue. Her career suffered a slight decline in the 80s, although she has continued to act ever since then, and also turned her hand to directing. Her most recent role was a voice performance in 2020. She is 94 to 96. She stops to listen to a tape recording, which she proceeds to cut. Clearly the plan is to fake a kidnapping rather than commit one. If you had seen the TV movie 3 years earlier, I'm not sure you necessarily connect it to this immediately. It looks different, shot in a style that is much closer to how the rest of the series would be. It sounds different, with the score also more connected to the series score than the earlier movie. And the general mood is different. One woman acting suspiciously, but not in a way that makes it easy to know for sure what she's up to. It cuts to a grand manor house where a man goes in and sorts through his mail, before noticing that Leslie is sitting in a chair waiting for him. Before he can say much more than establish that they know each other, she shoots him, and we get one of those experimental filmmaking flourishes that looks very dated today as the camera freeze frames on her, then cuts closer on the still image of her and the eyes of the man she's just shot, making it look almost like a flick book. There are incredibly artistic shots in Irving's previous Columbo that you aren't aware of unless you're really looking for them, and I personally greatly prefer that. It will be interesting to see if it makes a comeback in the relaunch series, as this sort of style became fashionable again in the 90s. With the man dead, she goes about covering up the murder over the opening credits, covering the body before putting it in the boot/trunk of her car and getting ready to drive off. But she's forgotten his briefcase. Luckily for her, she remembers and comes back for it. Worth noting that the opening credits are in white, not the yellow we would become familiar with. Clearly the show hasn't quite found its style yet. She drives the body to a cliff edge before rolling it into the sea. She then posts her ransom letter, surely the ransom for a dead man of the title. Back at home, she calls a friend, Pat, and asks her to remind her to play tennis with her the next day. She relaxes with a drink, and we get a transition via a clock face to the next day, where Leslie is in court, where she's a lawyer. We're given the impression that she's pretty heartless and shifty at first as she gets an insurance company off a heavy compensation claim. But this gives way to a more caring side as she tells her client,
I've been all over that building of yours, and you better start maintaining minimum safety standards or the next time somebody may get killed.
At her office, the phone call comes in from her friend, who quickly hangs up, but Leslie pretends someone is still on the line, and it's the kidnappers. Again, a similar ploy to that in Negative Reaction, and one that would really not work today, as the police would immediately know where the phone call came from and how long it lasted, but one that would have worked back in 1971. Back at her home, the FBI are there, putting in a phone tap to record the calls, and we are reminded she's set up a tape recorder with the dead man's voice on it. The doorbell rings, and it's Columbo, looking more familiar than he did in Prescription Murder, with his rumpled suit and scruffy hair, looking for a pen. As he's searching for his dropped pen, a call comes in to say the dead man's car has been found, which is the information Columbo is there to relay. It's not made clear up until this point that the dead man is actually Leslie's husband, and this is something I really like about the way this episode is written. We are shown he and Leslie know each other, then that she is feigning concern for him, and we can infer that they are a married couple, but it's not explicitly stated until this very organic way.
Do you know exactly what time your husband would have left Phoenix?
Excuse me. May I see the envelope, please?
Oh, Shirley.
No.
Establishing relationships between characters is one of the hardest challenges for screenwriters, as no one in real life ever says, "But you're my brother," or something similar. But they already know that, so why would they be saying it out loud? Yet, if it's important to the story, it has to be conveyed to us, the audience. And doing it like this is far more natural. Columbo looks over the ransom note as the FBI agent speaks with Leslie. Columbo is surprised to discover the ransom drop is to be made by air, as Leslie has a pilot's license. Columbo takes great interest in how the feds operate, and then wanders around the house before being questioned by Leslie as to what he's up to. This is really interesting to see in this extended length episode. While they don't necessarily have to show that in shorter episodes, and it would be a bit repetitive to do so, I think it's safe to assume from the way that Columbo just occasionally appears out of rooms and in locations he's not supposed to be, that this is something he does at every crime scene, just meticulously examining every detail and wandering around every part of the location of the crime scene. The agent in charge, Carlson, comments on how together Leslie is, which is also something Columbo notices. Is she being too calm? A call comes in from the device Leslie had rigged up, which plays the tape she cut together, and afterwards she has an emotional outburst which Columbo again finds very interesting. She goes to bed and he remains, pondering as the FBI leave, Carlson rousing him from his deep thoughts. He tells Carlson he finds it curious.
The phone rang. She ran to the phone. She picked up the receiver, and she never asked her husband if he was all right.
Carlson puts him down to stress, but clearly Columbo thinks there's more to it. Here we get another hint towards his methods of examining incongruity between a person's behaviour over how he would expect them to act. Not necessarily an indicator of their guilt, but a trail of breadcrumbs being laid down for him to follow, to see if it does lead anywhere. In the series, he usually explores this with the murderer, but as it hasn't been revealed that there's been a murder at this point, he does it with Agent Carlson as a substitute. The drop is to be made, and Columbo clearly has some thoughts on this. We spend a lot of time watching Columbo think, and while I appreciate it in this pilot, I'm glad it's not something that stayed with the series, which gave him a little more credit when it came to the speed his mind works. He does all his thinking off screen. Something else noticeable is how much camera movement there is as the camera tracks and zooms in ways which would quickly fall out of favour with directors. It's not as bothersome as some of the other now defunct camera techniques, but it is quite noticeable. At the airfield, Leslie switches the ransom bag with an identical one before boarding her light aircraft. The feds and Columbo are following in a helicopter. It's quite a brilliant plan. She can drop the empty bag anywhere and it will be impossible to know that there were never any kidnappers and the ransom was never in the bag. Her husband will never be released and the authorities will be on a wild goose chase until they eventually give up. Even if the body is found, it will look as if the kidnappers did it. Unfortunately for Leslie, Columbo is on the case. This sequence perhaps goes on a little too long, but they spent money on the helicopter and plane, so they're going to get their money's worth. The empty bag is found, but for obvious reasons, no one spotted the kidnappers collecting it. Mission apparently accomplished. Back at the airfield, Columbo has a snoop around and checks Leslie's locker on a hunch, but she's already collected the bag of money and is hiding it in her home. She's startled by the appearance of her stepdaughter Margaret, concerned about her father's kidnapping.
How is my father?
What are you doing here?
She's returned from school in Switzerland, and it's made clear that these two dislike each other, but Leslie has to pretend to show concern for her husband and his daughter. While Margaret does come off as a little bratty, she's also deeply suspicious of Leslie's concern for her father, especially as Leslie returns to work quite soon afterwards. At the courthouse, Carlson arrives with Columbo to inform Leslie her husband is dead, and Columbo questions her reaction.
Something's bothering you. No, it's just that up until now, you know, she was very cool and she was very composed, and she suddenly fell apart in front of other people.
Carlson believes nothing is wrong and is definitely fulfilling the role the murderer would take in later episodes by coming up with reasonable excuses for Leslie's behaviour. He threatens to speak to Columbo's superiors, but Columbo throws his own weight around.
This is not just a kidnapping. This is a murder now. And I kind of figure that's my department. I'll see you around.
It's an unexpected power move from Columbo that's really fun to see. As he's not speaking to the suspect, he can afford to be a little more honest. At the funeral, Margaret slaps Leslie, accusing her of getting everything she wanted. Columbo is there observing and sees an opportunity to find out more about Leslie from Margaret, whose suspicion of Leslie is growing. Leslie tells Margaret she had to use Margaret's trust fund to pay the ransom, so Margaret will have to get a job if she plans to stick around. Leslie does seem to have gotten everything she wants. Columbo waits at Leslie's office and speaks with her associate, making an out-of-character sexist remark, which Feels like it must have a purpose, but it's hard to tell exactly what that purpose is.
I don't know how you do it.
Do what?
Work for a woman.
Well, it doesn't bother me. Just so happens that she's one of the best trial attorneys in this state.
In Leslie's office, he sees the device she used to fake the phone call and makes a note of it before questioning her more in depth about the little things that are bothering him, which Leslie obliges by trying to answer them for him, implicating herself in the process. He questions the angle of the bullet, which causes her to flash back to the murder in another creative flourish. I don't wish to harp on about this too much, but in this case it really bothers me more than at any other time, because we should be relying entirely on Grant's performance to tell us what's going on in her head rather than seeing these flashes. Grant is a fantastic actor, more than capable of conveying her emotional state at this moment than these flashes of the murder can. I would have much preferred just to see her act. Columbo manages to convince her to help him explore the possibility this was a simple murder, and she begrudgingly accepts, but insists they do so while she's flying, which she uses an excuse to terrify him with her aerial tricks. It's a pretty good way of keeping him distracted, and seems to work, although once back on the ground, Columbo hints that he thinks she did it. While Columbo is indulging in one of his few pleasures, a bowl of chili, he is approached by Margaret, who tells him she thinks Leslie did it. Essentially, she confirms all of Columbo's suspicions, but he downplays it to her, before putting some ideas in her head.
Now, it just occurred to me that the only possible way would be if somehow there never was a kidnapping.
She killed him, then set it up to look that.
And of course, there's your father's keys.
What about them?
We never found them.
I'm not a big fan of this scene. It's an effort to relay information to the audience about where Columbo's thinking is, but as an experienced detective already suspicious of Leslie, he would know how putting this information into Margaret's head could put her in danger. Margaret uses this conversation to provide Columbo with the keys to her father's car he was looking for, apparently proving Leslie's guilt. But Columbo knows that she had those keys cut earlier that day and planted them. It's odd because he knew this would happen. He set it up. And the only reason for this seems to be to tell Leslie that he knows she did it, and Margaret suspects the same. It feels like a scene only added to slightly pad the runtime and doesn't really work. At Leslie's office, he calls her on the phone while simultaneously appearing in person, demonstrating he knows how she faked the call from her husband. This tactic is clearly starting to get to Leslie, but she is determined in her resolve. He claims he's been taken off the case and says his goodbyes to her. When she returns home, Margaret is waiting for her with a gun, threatening to kill her.
Hello. How do you like it, Leslie? Just giving you the same kind of welcome home you gave my father.
The gun is filled with blanks, and Leslie chases after Margaret when she runs away, running into some of the ways that she faked the kidnapping before cornering Margaret, who says she wants to make a deal with Leslie. She wants her trust fund back if she's going to leave Leslie alone, and Leslie agrees, taking her to the airport the next day to return to Switzerland. After Margaret is gone, Leslie bumps into Columbo and offers to buy him a drink, convinced she's got away with it. Over drinks, he tells her he now has the evidence he needs. He's got her to reveal where the ransom money is. Margaret was working for him the whole time. I would describe this as a good pilot, but I don't think it's a particularly good Columbo episode. It doesn't quite come together as cohesively as either the series or the pilot TV movie. The intent seems to be to make it appear as if Columbo is struggling to solve the case all the way up to the final reveal, but it doesn't really seed that throughout the episode enough to make it convincing, and so comes off as kind of wishy-washy. I think it's pretty obvious Margaret is doing his bidding, as it seems like there's no way she would forget her father's murder in exchange for some cash, and they try to explain that away due to Leslie's character flaws, but she is shown throughout to be far too sharp to fall for such a simple ruse. There are some really enjoyable moments, and we can see the basic skeleton of how a future episodes could build on and improve the formula, but it just isn't cohesive here. It feels as if I was being pulled in different directions in the story to disorientate me into not knowing what is going to happen next, rather than an effort to actually surprise. But this doesn't have the desired effect. It just made me more aware that what was going to happen next was exactly as I expected. It telegraphed exactly what was going to happen by being too obvious in trying to hide what was going to happen. Like if a magician said, "Look over there," before he made something disappear. The performances are all great. Grant does a fantastic job of playing different emotions, giving her character a little more depth than Cold-Blooded Black Widow. Patricia Mattick is great as Margaret, fully committed as the impulsive, angry and vengeful teenager, and of course Falk is ever reliable. The direction is largely fine, other than the things I've already mentioned, but is not nearly as subtly creative as Prescription Murder. For those reasons, I have to give this a 3 out of 5. Competent, watchable, and with some enjoyable moments, but thank goodness it got so much better so quickly. Thank you. Goodbye.